People ask about prayers. They say, are prayers effective? And the answer is yes. And how do we know that that is true? Because we are told to pray in the Bible. And God would not have the apostles that write the epistles. He would not do that if, in fact, prayers didn't mean anything. So the way that we can view this is that any prayer that is not given will not be answered. Okay? God hears our prayers. He knows everything that ever happens in all of time, all of space, all of history. He knows everything. Okay? And he knows whether we will pray or not. And so he's already factored that in. But the fact is that if we don't make that prayer, it's not factored in. Okay, it's the same thing with salvation. People say, well, if God already knows that you're going to decide to be saved, then you don't have free will. Absolutely not. I don't know how people can come to that conclusion. I've given examples of this in sermons and in commentaries a million times, and I never exaggerate. I can say on Sunday, okay, I know who's going to come into this church. All right, we've been here long enough where I know that if Tom A comes into the church on Sunday morning, if I put a thing for him, a note for him on a certain chair, and he comes in and he sits down and he picks up that note, that does not mean that he didn't have free will to go to that chair and sit down. It means that I knew he was going to sit down in that chair. And I'm just a guy. I know the habits of people. And so I make a logical conclusion that he is going to be here Sunday because he was fine last night when I talked to him. And he shows up at church on Sunday morning, and I leave a note there because it's the chair he always sits in, and he sits down there and he gets his note. That doesn't mean that he didn't have free will. It simply means that I knew what he was going to do. Now think of God, who knows every single thing that ever happened in the stream of time in history. Everything that has happened or will happen. He knows that that guy is going to pray, or he knows that that guy isn't going to pray. And so the prayers are factored in by God. If we don't make them, they weren't factored in because he knew that we were not going to make them. And so I don't know if that helps you, but I get that question all the time about prayers. Well, how do I know that my prayers are being heard? Because God is God. That is the answer. God hears. Whether he responds or not is totally up to him. It's totally up to him whether he responds to a prayer or not. And you know, there's the different cliche sayings that people say about that. You know, sometimes God will say yes, sometimes no. And, you know, they got all kinds of little cliches that people say about prayer.
Wait.
Yeah, or wait, okay, whatever. But the point is that God is not required to answer the prayer the way that you want it to be answered. Just because, you know, you've asked it doesn't mean that it's a given that he's going to respond the way you want. But he's not going to respond at all if you don't pray. And that's why we pray. And we know that this is the case because of verses like this. And there are many other such verses. There are many other such verses. It's the water that makes me do this. It's not, drinking doesn't help. It makes it worse.
Stop drinking.
Well, that's just it. I stopped 4 hours ago and I'm still doing this. I should not have drank that cup of water at lunch is what I shouldn't have done. But that is the situation when you see these type of prayers. And then one other thing about prayer before we go on is that Paul speaks of the prayers of the many. And he kind of refers to it here. He says, for I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayer. And he's speaking to a whole congregation. When he says the prayers of the many, it means that God hears many prayers and not just one prayer. He's hearing the prayer of John and Tom and you know, Claudia and all these different people. He hears all their prayers and he is factoring in every single one of them. And he does respond according to his wisdom, according to your prayers, but above all, his will must come first. And that's why James says in the epistle that he wrote that when you say, I'm going to this city or that, you shouldn't say that. You should say, if the Lord wills. Because every good thing comes down to the will of the Lord. If you are going to go to that city or not tomorrow is totally up to whether he keeps you alive or whether a snowstorm comes or any other thing. God is sovereign, and we must remember that. And if we can